Let me welcome you. I'm Stan Altman, Dean of the School of Public Affairs. This is the third and final policy breakfast in our series that we do every year. And before I make my just few comments, and then I know you're here not to hear me, but to hear the panel this morning, I just want to acknowledge two people and a few people from our staff who are here with us this morning. First and foremost is the future president of Baruch College, Ned Regan, who's with us this morning, and the chairman of the School of Public Affairs Advisory Board, Mr. Martin Begun. These policy breakfasts, while they may seem easy to do when you're here watching them, are never easy to do when it gets time to the logistics of making them happen. Certainly the people we try to bring here to really take on what we consider to be timely and critical issues so that you, as interested members of the New York society, have an opportunity to hear both sides of the story. All of our policy breakfasts are built around the premise that there's no single answer to any one critical issue, and that what you need to do as an informed consumer of kind of policy information is to hear more than one side. So we always have people who have kind of different views when we construct these breakfasts. Critical for us as a School of Public Affairs in bringing people who are timely and who have, I think, real insights into the issues we deal with is really bringing people like today's panel. And for us, Barbara Fife, who's on our staff, who is an absolutely critical person in organizing all of these conferences. I want to acknowledge Barbara's efforts for the whole year. And finally, Rob Sandrick, who's not here this morning, who actually does all of the graphics work and a lot of the administrative logistics, is another person I just want to thank. And so this morning is basically yours. We run this policy breakfast series because we believe that there are many, many critical issues that do not get an adequate airing and therefore require an opportunity for a more informed and reasoned debate over the issues. This series is supported, and that's the only way we're able to do this, by funds that we get from our own Baruch College Fund and money that the Achilles Foundation has made available to us. So with those final introductory remarks, I want to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Professor Doug Muzzio, who's on the faculty of the School of Public Affairs, who will actually make the formal introductions and then will, in fact, moderate the panel. Doug?
Welcome. I couldn't think of a more appropriate forum to end this series, the issue of privacy, the press, and politics. Particularly, we're in the midst of a Senate campaign where the issue of privacy has become paramount. We've just gone through a mayoral psychodrama where privacy and character are key issues. We're going to go through a presidential election where the presidential candidates are going to be probed, their personal lives probed, and their characters probed. We're extremely fortunate that we've got both Geraldine Ferraro and Joyce Purnick here. In a sense, we have two sides of the issue, the combatants, if you will, the antagonists, even though, in fact, that's not quite the case. Let me introduce Geraldine Ferraro first. Geraldine Ferraro, you may not know, is the president of G&L Strategies, which is a global consulting firm which provides information, strategic planning, etc., on women's workplace and marketplace issues. Now, what we do know is that we have an historic figure in our presence, the first woman presidential candidate of a major party who ran in 1984, first elected to Congress in 1978, and I'm proud to acknowledge the fact that I voted for you in 1978 as a resident in the famous 9th Archie Bunker Congressional District in Queens. Geraldine also served as a co-host along with Pat Buchanan in Crossfire, so she's well versed in the art of political give and take and commentary give and take. To my right is Joyce Purnick, who writes the Metro Matters column for the New York Times. Joyce was previously the deputy metropolitan editor of the Times and the metropolitan editor of the Times, and in one sense has been on the other side of this press political divide, even though I would say a very responsible member of the press in terms of both your columns.
No bias here.
And your, well, I went back and looked at columns to make sure that what I would say was accurate, and I would say that I would characterize it as responsible. Without any further introduction of them, let me just lay out what I see as sort of the basic questions, turn it over to them, interact with them with questions, and then turn it open to you folks. Basic questions. Are there limits? Or as the Times editorial said, how wide is the strike zone? Is everything fair game? Is the fact that once you enter public life, do you give up all privacy interests? The next question is, or if they're not limits, ought there be limits? And what ought these limits be? Third question is this no-holds-barred approach to privacy, the press, and politics here to stay? How did we get here? What are the dangers? What is the public interest? Is the public interest served by a no-holds-barred approach to politics and privacy? What is the public's right to know? With no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Joyce Purnick, since she is, in a sense, representing the offenders in this particular proceeding.
Absolutely. Right. Professor described me a few moments ago when he said I was going to speak first as the offending party. So the offending party will speak. I think that we have a very, very complex issue here that actually does not have two sides. It is multifaceted. And I would hope we'll discuss the issue here as opposed to he said, or she said, she said. The basic premise of your questions, and even the basic premise of what you're calling today's event, what is called press, politics, and privacy, is erroneous in my view. And that is because there is no press. Do you need me to speak? I'm sorry. Is that better? There is no press. There is no media any longer. I'm not sure there ever was, but there certainly isn't today in our society. What I mean by that is the following. How can you compare the Wall Street Journal to Current Affair? How can you compare the New York Times to the New York Post? How can you compare Vanity Fair to the New Yorker? How do you factor in Slate and that jerk Drudge and the Web and the roles that they play? Now, rather than speak theoretically, I figured since I've been an editor and I am a columnist and I've been a reporter for a long time, I'd give you a few examples of what I'm talking about, and then I'd stop and rather than sort of pontificate on the points. When I was Metro editor, I believe it was 2 summers ago, but don't hold me to it, I got a call on a Sunday. We have Sunday editors who sort of are on the desk, as we call it. And then if there's ever a sensitive issue, of which there are about 10 a day, the editor calls me or my deputy and says, we got to talk about this. So it was Sunday, and I was trying to get a little R&R, and the phone rings, and it's my weekend editor, and he says, Vanity Fair has a piece in tomorrow's issue that's coming out tomorrow, but they've sent us a press release, and they want an advance on their story. And it's about the mayor, Giuliani, and his press secretary, and it alleges that they're having an affair. You all, I'm sure, now remember this article. Okay. Huge splash of an article. I said, and this is, I mean, I wish I'd taped the conversation, and I'm not trying to sound noble. I'm trying to explain how the system works. I said, to whom do they attribute the allegations of an affair? He said, all anonymous sources. Do you want me to fax you the article? I said, no. Is there anything that is not anonymous which goes any closer than anyone has already to proving that there is a personal relationship? He said, no. I said, is there any implication that this alleged personal relationship in the article has any bearing on the job that the mayor is doing? He said, no. I said, we're not going to write a word. Not one word. He said, but Joyce, AP is already running it. It's going to be all over the tabs. It's going to be all over television. New York One will probably headline with it, which it did. I said, I don't care. We're not running a story based on anonymous sources that's been written by a reporter that I don't even know. I don't know her standards. I don't know their standards. But they don't meet our standards. We're not running it. Are you sure? Are you sure? I said, yes, I'm sure. Go check. The New York Times, you can check it on the web if you want. The New York Times did not run one word of that story in Monday's paper. Remember, it was Sunday in advance for Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair was trying to get publicity. Fine, that's their prerogative. My point is, it didn't matter. The New York Times Metro editor and her high standards and all that didn't make any difference. I never thought it would, but my point is, there is no such thing as the press. I set my standard. This article didn't mean it. I wouldn't print a word, and the next day, all hell broke loose. And the mayor, as he would have to, addressed it at a newspaper, was asked about it, as he would have to be, at a news conference. And I happened to know from the reporter that I had down there that the beat reporters were very embarrassed by the whole thing. They didn't really want to have to ask it, but they did, because it had been in the media. He responded. His response then became a news story. There was nothing what are we going to do? Say, we're not going to, and then here's the problem. The problem is, if you print a public official's response to something that you think was not warranted to print, you've then got to print it anyway. Because what are you going to say? The mayor responded yesterday, but we're not going to tell you to what? I mean, think about it. So we wound up running a modest story about the mayor's response to a story that we hadn't even printed to begin with, because we had to, because that's the current 24-hour multimedia cycle that we are living in. When Jennifer Flowers, check this too if you want to check the archives. When Jennifer Flowers had her news conference saying that she'd had a 12-year, as I remember, relationship with Bill Clinton, some newspapers went wild with it. Other newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, did not. The New York Times, and I happen to remember the discussions. I wasn't an editor then, but I actually do remember the discussions. The New York Times ran a very small article on an inside page. On the left-hand side, if you're a newspaper reader, you know that at the right-hand side of a newspaper is the more prominent place. Down at the bottom, and it was about maybe 500 words, just enough to say, because we knew we had to print something. But we were trying, the editor was trying to telegraph to the public what we thought of this story. I mean, she had been sponsored by some conservative organizations. We didn't think that she was speaking with much credibility, so on and so forth. It didn't matter. So I'm just sort of throwing out ideas for discussion here. I don't know if you are a responsible member of the media, if you're a responsible editor, if you are a responsible reporter, and you make sort of calibrated judgments about not what to print, about what to print and how to print it, and whether something is worth a lot of attention or a little bit of attention, modest attention, whether you want to blow it up and put it on the front page. You can make those judgments, but we are living in a world where you do have a 24-hour news cycle and things are happening constantly. I think the other issue, which I'm sure we'll get to, is self-censorship. You asked, Professor, what are the limits? I would ask, and I hope we discuss it this morning, who sets them? In a free society with the First Amendment, and thank God, no arbiter in this country of journalistic standards, because I believe that that's a slippery slope. Who sets the standards? Your answer might be the public. Well, the public is very fickle. The public doesn't really know what it thinks. The public said it did not care about Bill Clinton's conduct. Looking for the right word. And yet, as Ted Koppel pointed out when he did a lot of these sort of journalistic programs, he used to do them on Friday night during the impeachment hearings, you know, he'd get people together at town hall meetings and so on. If you weren't watching, we certainly wouldn't be spending all this time, you know, and all this commercial time showing it to you. The ratings were incredibly high. The public ultimately decided that it did not care politically, and it continues to support Bill Clinton, but it also couldn't get enough of this stuff. It didn't care, the polls say, about Giuliani's personal problems and happinesses as well. But you know, it couldn't read enough about it or watch enough about it, according to polls. So I think it's a very complicated issue, is my only point. I don't think there's the issue of the offending party and the offended party. I think it's a very, very serious, complex issue, and I don't think we've worked our way through it. And maybe our salvation in a society where we have a free media is that we will never work our way through it. We'll just muddle our way through it. That might be the safest thing for society.
Thank you. If I may, perhaps one of the offended parties?
Let me first comment on Joyce's comments, and though offending and offended, we're actually friends. We're neighbors out in Fire Island, so I just want you to know that ahead of time. Listening to Joyce's comments about the fact that there is no media, God, you could have surprised me. It's almost like that argument of the devil made me do it when you talk about the article that was printed the next day in response to the mayor's press conference, and then you had to repeat the basis of the article in Vanity Fair. I think what Joyce has given us is what happens when that kind of a story comes into a responsible paper like the New York Times. What the New York Times does, and the other paper does, is they do respond to the second phase of it when the politician has to respond. But I want to get back to what is private, what is off limits, what is on limits, and what do politicians put themselves in for when they run for office. And I'd almost ask Ned to come up here because it's, you know, he's done this obviously a number of times in the state, and he, I'm sure, has his perspective on it as well. But if you take a look, and first of all, let me just say to you that I am a great supporter of the First Amendment, and as many times as I was hit personally by the press and the media, because I really do think they exist, I think if I were to take my choice of having a free press or living in a country where it was not free, give me the free press, give me the First Amendment, let them make mistakes sometimes, let them go over the line a lot of times if they want to, but at least keep it free. So I support the First Amendment. But I do think that when people run for office, they have a right to expect some privacy. One of the questions you asked is, what is the public's right to know? What is relevant? Let me go back to some of the instances where you might talk about relevancy and find it is so. And let me again get very personal. I'm looking at some of the faces in the audience. Some must have been little kids in 1984, but some of you are old enough to have remembered that campaign. You will recall during the course of the campaign that one of the first things that hit the press was release of our tax returns. And there were story after story about the fact that we were holding on to our tax returns and that there was obviously a problem with it. Well, the reason we were holding on to our tax returns, though the press and the media kept on asking us every single day about release of our tax returns, was because we needed to take the 30 days for the accountants to go through it and make sure that everything was all right so that we could respond to any questions and they could respond. And at that time, it was Arthur Young who was doing it. And they had to go back over not only the tax returns for the previous number of 6 years or 8 years, but they also had to go through all the papers that supported the numbers in the tax returns. So it took time. And we took the full 30 days. And I kept on pressing because I'm a politician. I kept saying, get it out, the press wants it fast. And they kept on saying, sorry, we're not going to certify unless we're absolutely sure that everything's right. So it took 30 days. We did, some of you may remember, a press conference where the press was there with 200 reporters. I went into that press conference, and in campaigns, if you see people only talking to one mic, but they have what they call a mult box, and it goes out to all the different cameras and radio stations that are all sitting there with their little mics, it goes out from this one mic. And so it looks as if they're talking as I am into this one. And I walked into the room to do the press conference, and I had called my mother up before, and I said, say a prayer, because if this doesn't turn out all right, I'm going to leave the ticket. I went to the press conference, the mult box broke. And so I had to go back inside, waited, came back after about 15 minutes. I said, let's get this thing going, and what I want you to do, leave all the microphones there, because I want the public to see what I'm going through. And we went out, and as you may recall, Newsweek and Time and all the rest, it had pictures of me with all these mics in front of it. And it then it looked as if it was what it was, which was all these people against me. By the end of the press conference, believe it or not, some of the reporters actually applauded. And it was all over. Now, does the public have the right to know whether or not we pay our taxes? Absolutely. Do they have the right to know whether or not I give to charity? Absolutely. Those are all legitimate inquiries. But you may also recall that the New York Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer, now the New York Post, I agree with you, I don't think that you can say the New York Post and the New York Times in the same breath, though I have just done that. But you certainly can say the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times in the same breath. Philadelphia Inquirer had 20 or 21 investigative reporters on me. And what they were doing was they were checking every single name that they could find, anybody they could find with the name Ferraro, checking to see if there was anybody in organized crime in New Jersey. That is so wrong. They wanted to know, my father had been dead my father died when he was 44. He died in 1944. He died when I was 8. Is that legitimate inquiry? First of all, he wasn't involved in organized crime, but is that legitimate inquiry? No, absolutely not. Even if my father had been Jack the Ripper, had spent, his final years killing prostitutes in London, would that impact on the type of person I was, especially since he died when I was 8? What relevance does that have to whether or not I would be a good public official? I think that there are limits. I think what happens with the press, and I will use it generically, is that a story gets told by Vanity Fair based on unnamed sources, which I find is offensive. I find that any worm that's going to say something about somebody, you're a worm if you don't give your name. And I happen to not think reporters who write that stuff are very much above that worm. I think that if you're going to say something about somebody, say it. If you ever see a quote that I have given, it always has my name attached to it, because there's no sense in saying something off the record or being unnamed, unless you want to hurt and are afraid to have yourself identified. I think the press has a responsibility to cut out the unnamed sources. You know the reason they don't? Because then they'd stop getting information. And whenever push comes to shove on this stuff, and now I get into my real cynical mode, is the media does a lot of this stuff because this is a big business. It's a much bigger business than it was 50 years ago, much bigger business than it was even 20 years ago. The competition between the print media, the television media, and we've got hundreds of cable channels now, all of whom are anxious to get material to put on their shows. We have the drudges on the internet. It's just all over the place. And the competition is there to get out first, get the people to read your paper, watch your station, listen to your program, read you on the internet, hook in and pay for it. That competition, the dollar, is really impacting in large measure on all of these issues of privacy, public life, and the press. So.
Can I ask a question before I open it to the floor? In terms of, well, we have some common ground here. We agree that there are lines. We don't quite know where they are, and we don't know quite who draws them. Also, we have the sense that what we're talking about is a somewhat new phenomenon in terms of this feeding frenzy with this 24-hour, 7 cycle, this age of celebrity, this age of scrutiny. If I may, Geraldine, what advice would you give a candidate running for public office about what they ought to release almost in a preemptive way rather than subject themselves to the press, if you will?
Let me say, first of all, what I tell young people, first thing I tell them is, if you want to go into politics, think of it as a serious career when you're young. And pay attention. I'm not talking about running for city council, with all due respect. I mean, the press is interested in what you're doing, but they're not going to go and spend tens of thousands of dollars to do investigations or anything to find something. Oh, you're happy about that? We have a candidate for city council up here. I want you to.
I was worried about that.
But I'm talking about people who are running who would eventually want to run for Senate, governor, because they see that is the universe from which the presidential candidates come from. I would say start early and plan your career as if that's where you're going to end up. Tom Downey actually did that. The only thing he got a little bit messed up was that he got defeated for re-election to Congress, but I think at one point I know that he had come out of college, and he had gone immediately into politics, was out in Fire Island, when he was like 25 years old, running for Congress, and then was planning, on a larger career. But I had bumped into him one point, and it was very funny. It was in April of 1984, and he said to me that he was releasing his tax returns at that point as a member of Congress. People weren't doing that. He had them certified every year by one of the big 7. I had this little accountant who would work for my father-in-law for 50 years. There's a difference. And so, what do? You prepare on something as silly as that, or as simple as that, ahead of time. The other thing, too, it's so funny, Barbara Mikulski was very funny. Barbara Mikulski, as you know, is a senator from Maryland. At one point she said, if you're a woman there, you have to look at where you're coming from in these things. She said, if you're married, people want to know if you're neglecting your kids. If you're a widow, they think you've killed them. If you're single, they think you're gay. And so she said, what are your choices? Well, I think of all things, I'd probably say it's easier to be single, especially if you're married to someone in small business. Nancy Pelosi, I think, if she ever decided to move into a field as run for president, I think she would probably be questioned. I think Dianne Feinstein has that problem when they're talking about her for vice president, because her husband's an investment banker. He does deals in China. Are they legitimate business deals? Absolutely. But could they be subject for criticism and investigation? Absolutely. I think you have that all the time. I think the double standard exists because men don't usually have that happen. They don't go into the wives' business dealings yet, but the more professional women who are married to men running for office, the more you're going to see that. So I think you can almost brace yourself in some ways by looking at your life, and you have to start young when you're 25 and just figure out where you're going to go and if that's what you want, which is sad. which is sad. You can't, in some instances, you can't be relaxed and easy. And finally, I mean, I think you do your best with your family, but if indeed your whole family is subject to this type of thing, sometimes kids make mistakes. I mean, and no matter how good a parent you are, what do? Are you responsible? Those are things that happen, I think, and I think that there has to be a line drawn, and no matter what a politician talks about as doing on their own as preventative actions, it's never enough if the press is not responsible.
Can I make
Yes,
2 points very quickly? I know you want to ask questions, so I'll be fast. First, at an optimistic note, I think that probably ultimately the question will not be drawing a line, because I fervently believe it's impossible in a free society to draw a line. I think the answer to the complexities and discomforts of this issue is with the public, and I think the public is changing. If you think back for a moment to that weird period when we disqualified was it Ginsburg for the Supreme Court because he said that in college he'd smoked pot? Think about that. Now we are at a period in our society where George W. Bush can, with public support, duck questions about whether he took drugs when he was a kid, a young man or whatever, because nobody really cares. I think that's progress. I think it's progress. So I think the public is drawing a line. They're learning. They have the right to know, and the public is making the determination about whether it cares. The public did not care. I think Rudolph Giuliani had a good chance, had he stayed in the Senate race, of winning, despite sort of that all of those personal issues about leaving his wife, and then she goes out and she has her news conference and parading his close friend. 10 years ago, this couldn't have happened. He'd be finished. The public really didn't care. I think that the public, maybe because it's been subjected to such a barrage of this stuff, is drawing its own line and saying, all right, we know about it, we don't care about it, let's move on. I think this is a very, very positive development in society. I think it's wonderful. So I think in a way the line is being drawn. That's the first thing. The other thing, and then I'll be quiet. I think the issue of anonymous sources is very, very, very difficult. You cannot say no anonymous sources if you have a free press, because then you wouldn't have Watergate. Wouldn't have had Watergate. I mean, I don't even know where to stop listing the kinds of stories, revelations that came from sources who were not anonymous to the press, but were anonymous to the people that they spoke about. It is the personal pejorative that you have to be very careful about, the kind that you were talking about, where someone is maligning somebody else, and you don't know who it is, you don't know what axe they have to grind, you don't know what's motivating them. That's one thing, and I think there's a strong responsibility on the part of the reporters and the editors, and I could write a book about this, to know whether the people that you are quoting and keeping those names from the public are credible, whether they're being motivated by telling the truth or whether they're being motivated by political interests, personal interests, so on and so forth. But I think it's impossible in a free society to simply erase anonymity from the media.
I think you can distinguish, and I think you did distinguish when you said that you distinguish an anonymous source who gives you, in the instance of Watergate, where the investigative reporters went out and corroborated what was said. A lot of things that you see for instance, in Vanity Fair or with any of these others, in the New York Post or any of these others,
you can't corroborate.
You can't.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
And if they're personal pejorative type things, they shouldn't be.
That I agree with.
I'll open it up. Eric?
One just quick comment, one question.
Loud, please.
The comment is that if you think that this press is dead, you should look at the press of the 19th century to really see where facts weren't even relevant. They didn't say anything, story about your brother.
But they didn't have television or the internet.
Well, the same issues were exactly the same issues with probably not as much. But as far as I was interested in one thing he said, this comes from my own experience in Howard Samuel's gubernatorial campaign in the 70s when it became a big issue of whether Howard's wife, his father, had been a member of the Vichy government. And there was this whole issue going on about how it would impact on the Jewish community. And we spent a lot of efforts trying to actually research the issue ourselves in the campaign. And let's assume that, and you raised this personally, I sort of mean nothing personally, let's assume that you had been 15 when your father had died, and in fact, which I know is not true, but in fact he had been a don in the mafia or something. Would that have not been relevant for your press-wise, for your career? I mean, should we have not known that publicly?
I don't know, but let me just say to you what impact, I mean, the implication is that children are everything their parents are. That's the implication. Even as an adult. I think if you carry that to the extreme, then you say that anybody who has ever had a parent who has done something wrong and who were a kid, and let's take somebody who has actually done something horrendous, someone who has killed somebody, someone who has been a bank robber, someone who has, somebody who's done really horrendous things, no doubt about it that they're criminals, and this is the way they spent their lives, and they end up going to jail and spending the rest of their lives. Are you saying that the child could never do anything again to pull themselves up and make themselves a different person? And that's the issue. Why is it relevant what a parent has done if the individual's life is very, very different?
Doesn't that get to the point? The other reason I raised it may not be relevant, but is it not reportable? In other words, its relevance will get determined by the electorate, but in terms of it being reportable, I mean, I certainly don't think that they should have obviously profiled you because you were Italian. They sent 23 people.
Yeah.
But let's assume it was a known state, something was known about it. For example, like Howard Samuel's wife's father. Was that reportable? Her father had, I can't remember his actual, it had been some kind of official.
Tell me what the relevance of it is to his race. Tell me what the relevance of this to what kind of governor he's going to be. If indeed his father-in-law was a member of the Vichy government 30 years before he ran. What's the relevance? It's not relevant.
But a mobster, let's say a Russian mobster, let's say it today, might be relevant to people because it might show who you know, where you were brought up. I don't know how I would choose as a voter.
Can I say something very quick? May I?
Sure.
I think the practical problem for journalists in a case like that is that inevitably, if somebody is running for office, someone's going to write a profile. Many people will write profiles. Profiles is just part of what we do. And when you're, the Times now, I think, is doing like a 15-part profile of Bush, and it's actually quite fascinating. Well, when you're doing a profile of somebody, you're going to come across things about their siblings, if they have children, their children, their parents, their spouses, and maybe the parents of their spouses. Do you make I'm not going to answer this question because I'm not sure what I would have done in this case, but I can tell you ultimately what would have happened. You come across something that Howard Samuels' wife's father was a member of the Vichy government. Do you make a conscious decision as a reporter, as you're writing this down in your notebook and you did the reporting and you confirmed it? Do you then make a conscious decision and say, gee, I don't think that's relevant to this race. I'm going to leave it out. You see, if you're a reporter, you're not going to make that judgment. You're not going to take that responsibility to censor that out of the story. You're going to say to yourself, and I've said these things to myself, I don't know. I don't personally think it's relevant, but if I know it, I think the public should know it and let them decide. Now, that may sound like a cop-out, but we're in the business of disseminating information. And I'll tell you something else. If you do make that decision, and I personally think it would have been the wrong decision, I think it would have been self-censorship. But if you make that decision, it's going to be public anyway, ultimately. You can make that decision, and if you can live with it, fine. There were many, many things as a reporter, writer, that I know that I have not printed because I couldn't verify them or I felt uncomfortable with them. They all wind up in print or in the electronic media in any case. But I think that's, Geraldine, that's the practical problem. The practical problem is you're going to stumble across information, and then you have to say to yourself, am I going to censor myself? Am I going to prevent the public from knowing what I've learned?
See, I think you're right. I think that is a cop-out, because I do think that reporters have a responsibility, and I think that what that responsibility is more than regurgitating everything that you pick up and find on someone. And let me just point out, I mean, you get somebody like Jesse Jackson, whose brother is in jail for murder. That was never brought up when he was running because it is not relevant to his life. And it's not relevant to what he could or would do had he ever really gotten to be in.
But how do you know what's relevant? How do you know what's going to turn out to be relevant?
I don't know. They didn't print his.
Just leave with you with that question.
Okay. President Reagan?
President Reagan, my God.
There's a spelling difference here and a personality difference, too.
Would you go down to the paymaster and tell him or her what you just said, call me? Eric had a way of talking about Howard Samuels and the Vichy government. I could take us back into history, too, I bet. And my question to both Joyce and Geraldine, where did all this start? Not just the invasion of privacy, that's conclusive, but the trivia that gets into so many newspaper columns and on television, and the war between what seemingly is war between the press and the politicians. Once I sat with a couple of scholars, we tried to figure it out. Who follow this stuff? Tom Patterson, a couple of people with the Pew Foundation. Remember, where was there an identifiable point where this started? And we came up with this. We go back to the JFK primary. It's West Virginia, and he's giving a speech. And FDR Jr. is in the audience. And it comes for the Q&A. And FDR Jr., and he phrased it much better than I'm going to phrase it, but we all know the story, I think, raised his hand and said, John, Senator, would you take orders from the Pope? Words to that effect. And Kennedy gave this marvelous answer. Marvelous answer. It made everybody's front page, raised the issue, and buried the issue all at once. Reporters wrote it straight. And sitting around later, the next day, began to scratch their heads and said, we were had. How did Franklin Roosevelt Jr. happen to be out in the hills of West Virginia? How did JFK happen to give this marvelous answer? They were manipulated by politicians. I know you've never done it. I'm telling you, I'm going to put a teeny bit of balance into this. And maybe a lot of politicians, whether it's invasion of privacy, whatever, trying to get what they deserve. But that's another story. Do you think it started someplace like that? The 50s, there was a lot of respect on both sides. In the 1960s, if that was the primary time, if that was the primary date, the 60s were about to wash over us, that if anything goes. Was there a point where this started, and is there some legitimacy in what is taking place? I'll ask both of you.
Let me just make a couple of comments. One is, going back, since you mentioned FDR Jr., let's go back to FDR. Because when he was president, obviously he was in a wheelchair. At that time, people looked, at that time when FDR was president, he was in a wheelchair. When he ran, he was in a wheelchair. When he was governor, he was in a wheelchair. At that time, still some stereotyping still exists today, but the stereotyping of that time was that someone in a wheelchair is certainly not strong enough to do anything, let alone lead a nation. And so the press did not report that. Did the press have a responsibility? Was it relevant? I don't know. I mean, was that more relevant than, Gary Hart meeting Donna Rice, who is now born again and doing wonderful things? Was that relevant? In the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower was president, everybody knew about his affairs. Obviously, he didn't call me up and tell me about them, but there was evidently, the common knowledge about his affairs. Nobody printed them. When John F. Kennedy, even if he manipulated that question, he did it because it wasn't as if people weren't saying, the Catholic can't be president of the United States. Remember Al Smith, and who, by the way, somebody told me was Italian, but he wasn't a real Italian because it was his grandmother or somebody who was Italian. So I'm still the first Italian American to run for national office. But remember, he was a Catholic, and when John F. Kennedy was running, everybody kept saying, a Catholic can't be president of this country. The Vatican's going to be there. So the only way that he could get out a statement and frame the issue, again, I wasn't there either, but it seems to me, was having someone ask the question and let him come out and address it frontally. And I think that made sense. But that was a legitimate concern for the people in this country. I think you will find that when you find someone who's Jewish coming up, someone saying, especially if they're an Orthodox Jew, can they run for national office? I would bet if Joe Lieberman gets the vice presidency, people are going to be saying, can he do this? He takes off Friday nights and Saturdays. Suppose something happens. What do you do? Those are the kind of things, those are legitimate, relevant questions when you're talking about national office. What I distinguish, Ned, between that type of personal question about your faith, about your finances, I distinguish between that and having an affair, and so did the press, with Kennedy as well. The Catholic issue was important. What he was doing to violate the Catholic rules in private was not, So that again, I think you have to distinguish between the personal issues.
You wanted to know when it started. My colleague Gail Collins has a book out about gossip in America, political gossip in America. It probably started with Washington, and I'm not being facetious. There is an enormous, and I know you're really talking about the current environment, but it's all related. It all builds on the past, and there is an enormous appetite on the part of the press. On the part of the public, maybe the media too, obviously. For gossip. We love it in this country. We love it in every country. I don't think it's you go to a third world country and you'll see they don't have enough to eat, but you'll see pictures of movie stars, and that's just maybe it's a release for people. I don't know. Just very. A thought, I know there are a lot of other questions, so I want to be real fast. A thought about the contrast between not writing about Eisenhower and his alleged affairs, and FDR and his, he also had relationships, as did others, and writing about Clinton. There's a difference, which is that in previous cases, of presidents having relationships with women, not their wives, the women didn't come forward or weren't taped by a friend. And I'm quite serious. So that you come back to the question I was asking, which is really self-censorship. If you have a Jennifer Flowers coming forward, if you have I blocked out her name, so bothers me. Not Paula Jones, yeah, but I meant the one who taped Monica Lewinsky, Linda Tripp, and it leads to a legal case and lawsuits and so on. It's not the same as reporters saying, well, we think JFK fools around, but we don't know with whom and how we're going to find out. Big difference.
And let me just make one other comment, too, and that's if you take a look, for instance, you can distinguish between the candidate and the candidate's family, is the Eagleton instance, where he had had treatment, and the Kitty Dukakis instance. Eagleton, yes, legitimate inquiry. Dukakis, no, none of our business.
To Ms. Ferraro, I've always felt that some aspects of your personal life and your family's personal life that were pursued by the media every time you ran for office were not relevant to your running for office or holding office, and so it's fair for you to...
That's not true.
Fair for you to consider that they were invasions of your privacy. What I do think is fair game, and mentioning Tom Singleton, I would say the same thing if he were sitting there, is that it seems to me that when the presidential nominee or his staff expressed an interest in you being a running mate, I don't know that this conversation didn't take place, but I suspect it didn't. What would have been fair at that point was to say, now look, there's some things you should know. I don't think they're relevant to my being a candidate or how I perform in the office, but it may come out and you're entitled to know in advance to see whether you want to deal with it or not.
Well, and that's fair, if indeed you had any sort of a clue that someone was going to charge you with things that didn't exist. For instance, we were in San Francisco, and immediately as soon as I got the nomination, the press was all down at City Hall, taking up every seat there, looking through every one of my husband's buildings to see if there were violations. New York Post ran an article while we were in San Francisco at the convention, quoting a young woman who said that my husband did not give her heat. And I said to him, John, how could you do that? And he said, I never gave her heat, and I will never give her heat. And I said, how could you say that? And he said, she's not a tenant of mine. You know. Well, the story ran once. I'm sure there's some people who believe that. It never ran again. But I mean, and that's why, I mean, if actually what happened was when they went down to City Hall, they went down. They said that if every landlord in New York City was the way he was, there wouldn't be, you know, they wouldn't have problems. So when you're saying, yeah, you tell them ahead of time, what am I going to tell them? What, the stuff on this organized crime crap, if it were true, I would have said, yeah, my father was a don in the family. But he wasn't. He was a businessman up in Newburgh, you know, who owned a bar. I mean,
But could you not anticipate the microscope of a presidential campaign?
absolutely. Not really. Not really. I truly believe that because I'm an Italian American, I was treated differently. I have to tell you, Peter Odino, on the Columbus Day before the election, I was in New Jersey marching in their parade as well as this. I'm big on parades. And while we were walking, Peter Odino said to me, God, this is awful, because he had lived through this stuff. And I said, what happened? He said, in 1976, when Carter was looking for vice presidential candidate, Peter Odino was at the top of the list because of what was going on in Watergate. Now remember, the judge in that case was somebody by the name of Sirica. Rodino was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Rodino said to me that at that time, there were the rumors about organized crime in his family. Now, if you don't have an Italian name, it's easier. Mario Cuomo, you recall, went through the same thing. So when you say, can you anticipate it? Dear God, no. Remember when I got the nomination, and I think maybe if I had run for president, that might be a legitimate thing where you can turn around and say, oh dear God, this is a possibility. Let me do this all ahead of time to find out. Running for vice president, you kind of get picked. As much as there was all this rumor and talk about this going on, and I loved it. I really loved being part of that. I was platform chair. I was going around the country. I was going to run for the Senate in '86. It was terrific. But I was a member of Congress from Queens. Now, I would bet that the New York Times has never profiled a member, at least until '84, a member of Congress from Queens. Do you ever know?
I think it would depend on what...
Never. Never.
so
I'll
sure
tell you
about
what. Because, and I'll tell you what. Because when I was a
Ben
freshman.
Rosenthal, wasn't he?
Well, please. I mean, it was after he died that you did that. I'm sure you'll do it for me too when I die.
No.
but it was.
Check the archives for you.
But it was so funny because I did an exchange thing with a guy from Oklahoma, Mike Sinar. I went down to Oklahoma. I got the best press in Oklahoma that you could ever want to see. He got wonderful press there. I think they mentioned that he was in with me. My name was kind of on the bottom. But when I ran for office, national press never paid, obviously, any attention to a member of Congress. Queen, my New York press paid very little attention to us. So all of a sudden, and it was partly my fault, in that I thought I was still from Queens, and all of a sudden I was a national candidate. I mean, when I make a joke like, oh God, my husband likes his privacy, you know he's an Italian man, and then Mario Cuomo comes and attacks me, you know I'm doing the wrong thing. You know, you kind of know I'm doing the wrong thing. So I was a little naive, and I'll take that. I didn't know how to deal with the press. And it's partly my fault, but there is no way that you can prepare for charges that are basically untrue and that are trying to go at you personally. I mean, there's just no way that you can prepare for that.
What about Eagleton? Should he have?
Eagleton, I think he should have said that he had
Janet?
help.
Thank you. This question is primarily for Mr. Purnick, and that I really want to ask about the intersection between privacy and hypocrisy. And by that I mean that if someone running for office or a public figure proclaims to be something he or she is not, what criteria do you have to talk about that the private life that contradicts the public life? Because I personally think that goes to character and that goes to the public's right to know.
I agree with you. I think that was the big issue really with Gary Hart. He sort of became emblematic of that. I'm not saying that what happened he wouldn't have happened anyway, his being pursued by those reporters, I think was it Miami? But I'm sorry, I forget the city. But you may remember that he gave an interview which ran in the New York Times in the magazine. E.J. Dionne wrote it. I remember it very well. And in it, there had been all of this whispering about his cheating on his wife, frankly. He had decided to address it in this interview. And he said, you don't believe me, follow me. You know, that may not be, it was follow me around. And he had this, when he announced his candidacy at one point, he had his wife and his children. And it was a false front. And I think that level of hypocrisy, if you are a candidate, if you're a public figure and you are trading on a certain kind of image, and trying to get votes through that image, and that image is a false image, you're asking for it. You're asking to be sort of unmasked. It's not right. The public should not have a distorted view, negatively or positively. And it's not a moral judgment. I think it's a judgment of the public's right to know what the truth is, or as close as we can get to the truth.
You'll be surprised, but I agree, and I would go further. For instance, if you have somebody who's a right-to-lifer, and pays for their girlfriend's abortion. Hello. Yeah. We're entitled to know that. You know, I think that's relevant.
Totally
because it
agree.
goes to the issue, and it goes to the character of the individual. So even though it's a girlfriend, it's her abortion, you know, don't get up there and scream about it and then pay for it.
Barbara?
Yeah, I have two comments. If you look at, is there damage in all this to the sort of public interest, not to the candidate or the individual, but to the public interest? It might be in terms of discouraging people of quality from putting themselves forward because, not because knowing something's wrong in their background, but because they know everything will be out on the table. And it certainly has something to do with sort of using up everybody's attention so issues are just blocked out, and sort of the substance of what that person is going to do in office or issues that divide candidates become impossible to put before people. So those are kind of two possible negatives to the public interest by this kind of excessive sort of peeking around at everything in people's lives. And then just another point, Joyce, I'm talking about people, you know, when the press knows something and it's, you know, not, it's clear, it doesn't need to be corroborated, that they should put it out and let the public judge. How about the fact that the press knew for months about Rudy Giuliani's special friend? In fact, it was guessed at the Inner Circle, a dinner in which the press is the host. and everybody sat on it.
All right, I'll take that one first because that's easy. We didn't know. We did not know. There may have been individual reporters who knew. I don't know who those reporters are. I didn't know. I don't know anyone on the Metro staff of the Times who knew. We knew that his marriage was in trouble. The whole city of New York knew that. It wasn't a secret. In fact, when it comes down to that hypocrisy factor, one of the reasons I think this may not have hurt him had he pursued candidacy is because he and his wife, Donna Hanover, did not lie about it, and that they were having marital problems. Yes, he brought what is her name? I keep Judy Nathan. He brought Judy Nathan to the inner circle. You've been to the inner circle. Those of you who have not, it's a huge bash. There are 10 to 12 people at each table. I didn't see her. I was at the inner circle. I assume she was one of these 10 to 12 people at this table. Anyone who saw her there must have assumed that she was one of 5 other people who were sort of anonymous and probably some staff person. It was starting to emerge. He was almost begging for it to be reported. And she was starting to turn up at a lot of different things. And I remember talking to one reporter for one of the tabloids who said to me, I was beginning to wonder, who is that woman? He was starting to see her at a town hall meeting, at the parade, and he knew she wasn't a staff member because he works out of room 9, the City Hall press room, but he did not know who she was. There may have been a reporter or two who did before it broke. I don't know who that reporter is. So that's a false rumor. It really is a false rumor that we knew and we sat on it. Whether it should have been pursued more aggressively, I can't say. It raises all of these issues that we're talking about today. In terms of whether the focus on gossip-type level stuff is discouraging quality people from entering politics or discouraging or angering or annoying voters or potential voters, probably. I think it goes back to the question that I raised at the very beginning. What do you do about it? Do you set yourself up as an individual reporter, individual editor, as an arbiter of taste and say, no, I'm not going to let the public know this, that, or the other thing? And that's the issue we're discussing, and of course, there's no answer to it.
Hi. Number one, talking about it just for a moment, FDR and disabilities, I find it rather interesting still to this day they're doing that FDR statue. The tremendous controversial issue was, should he be in a wheelchair or should he be standing? So that issue still remains. Number two, what annoys me is particularly at the last minute, those are the commercials by politicians, mudslinging that goes on, the accusatory, ambiguous statements that are made by some of the politicians, and then the reaction of the media, or the frenzied reaction of some of the media, without even investigating as to what is going on in the commercial. I'd like to comment on that. There was done by D'Amato. It was done by many others over many years. It's ambiguous. It's often sometimes misleading.
They pay for those commercials, so that.
But the press reaction I find rather interesting. The printed media, how they react to it. Often misquotes are started from that, which can hurt the candidate that's in opposition.
I can only tell you what we do with the commercials, and I'm sure you've seen them. We have something called an ad box, and we say this is the assertion in the commercial. This is the obvious effort. What the candidate is trying the constituency the candidate is trying to reach, or the message the candidate is trying to make with this commercial. Here are the facts, and here is, I forgot what we called them, but,
You do an accuracy.
we do an accuracy, thank you. We do an accuracy assessment. In other words, we say, here's what the candidate says about this, that, or the other vote. Here are the facts.
Where I've written, I don't read the post that often, but I've seen a post or a number based on misleading information on those commercials, and that then it's just, where is the media fairness in that? And responsibility reporting. It's rather difficult.
Why aren't you asking what the responsibility is of the candidate who's distorting in the commercials?
And why don't you also ask what
I do. Assistant leader, I do.
they have on the electorate, because unfortunately, all this distortion that we're all subjected to, and all the negative ads that we're all subjected to, and I can say that because I've never run one of them, is they are used because they work. I mean, I don't know about how you felt, and I'm a Democrat, but watching Corzine's commercials for the past 3 months here in New York was enough to drive me up a wall. And they started off negative. They started off with, Florio says this is going to be a slash and burn campaign. That's the way Florio does things, but we're going to run a positive commercial. Hello?
That's perfect.
And then introduce yourself. Now, I don't know what the next step is, but I even as a political person, when I see these commercials, I want to cry, because I think that they're just awful.
You often ask when it comes to endorsement time, how are you going to handle your campaigns and the commercials? Are you going to be doing negative campaigning? And often some of them, of course, don't live up to their agreement with the clubs, and of course you can see all the negative campaigning. But it's just the reaction of irresponsible newspapers that I find, yes, you say the politicians, but it's also how the newspaper or the printed word handles it, as well as television.
She speaks faster than I do.
Well, that's good. That's a New Yorker, come on.
Hi, I'm Lisa Gagnon, I'm representing the Manhattan Borough President. But it just seems to me that as much as the public drives has an interest to know what's going on out there, as much as the media has some right and some, we say, capitalistic interest in knowing what's going on out there, that political opposition really drives a lot of what is not just negative, but really what the negative news is about the candidate, about whether or not they're running, whether or not they're not. I guess everybody's always in a political cycle. But how much do you both feel that that is truly the case? I mean, that's what it seems to me. I've been involved in campaigns and seeing what I think, but it really seems to me that as much as I want to read something, as much as the paper prints something, that I can sort of almost dissect and detect what's being driven by political opposition. And that seems to be a major force in what gets looked at and what gets written a lot of times.
I think you're probably right, because as much as the reporters, papers have investigative reporters, it's nothing like the opposition research that goes on in individual campaigns. And you're right, those are a lot of those anonymous sources, those are a lot of the leaks, and those are a lot of the things that drive the stories and move them. So, yeah, I mean, again, looking at the anonymous sources, I think that that's the place where if it's legitimate, that's one thing, but I do think that there is a responsibility, again, by the part of reporters. Remember, though, and remember that, again, I keep, which the press hates to hear, this is a business. It is a competitive business. And once somebody else has taken that leak and run with it, and if they can't reveal a source, if they reveal a source, obviously they'll never get another one of those anonymous tips. So they're kind of almost caught in a catch-22 situation.
Yeah, I would say, in answer to that now we're getting to something that's really a little different, Lisa, which is that there's good and bad in everything. There are good politicians and bad politicians, and there are good reporters and there are bad reporters. Any reporter who takes a leak from opposition research of campaigns and does not treat that as sort of a basic, totally untested fact or alleged fact, and then starts from there and starts to do his or her own work checking it out, shouldn't have a press card. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. It's just anybody can say anything. If we printed everything everybody said, we'd be printing 3,000-word newspapers every day. We make judgments. And if the borough president's opponent in a race makes an allegation about her record, it's my obligation not to print the allegation, but to check the allegation and see if it's factual, A, and B, whether it's newsworthy. And that's journalism 101.
Right. Go ahead. What's your stance on campaign financial
We
disclosure?
can't hear in the back.
Stance on campaign financial disclosure. Public's right to know all financial contributors.
Well, it's the law. It's the law. I mean, he asked about campaign disclosure. Pardon me?
Donations.
No, in federal campaigns, you cannot have it. You can't have corporate contributions. That's why people want to get this soft money thrown out. And why? What's the number of this group? The 507 or something, or the whatever it is. I don't even know what the number is. That John McCain is talking about getting rid of, because it's a vehicle that is set up where people can give anonymously tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars to campaign. You know who's doing it? They complain. They say, well, the labor unions are the same way. Well, the labor unions. I mean, when they put up, they say this is done by the AFL-CIO. What are they looking for? Contributors to the labor unions? Labor unions, it's their money. They raise it. You know, they're not raising it from business. I mean, where else do you get labor money? They don't get it from, governments or anything. They get it from their members. They get it, from within. So if it says AFL-CIO, it's the AFL-CIO. If it's the construction trades, whatever trade union it is. I mean, to me, there is no analogy, no nexus between the two. But this other group, you have not a clue. You have not a clue as to who's contributing. That soft money is what we don't know about. In the hard money, in my congressional campaigns, every congressional campaign, you have to. They drive you nuts with the FEC. I mean, Beth Scully was my campaign manager last time around, and she can tell you, if somebody had the same name, we got back, and we went over $1,000 with Mary Smith. And Mary Smith, well, Mary Smith in Oklahoma, it doesn't happen to be the same Mary Smith in New York, if one is 82 and one is 25. And so therefore, it's two separate contributions that are allowed. But we had to go back and explain all those. So they do keep an eye on that. But it's the soft money. That's what McCain is complaining about. That's what Gore is complaining about. That's what Bradley was complaining about. That's what should be gotten rid of.
Carol?
My question is to Joyce about where you draw the line between self-censorship and your access to sources. As a fairly consistent reader of just the New York Times, I don't read the tabloids, and watching your reporting of the Clinton and Giuliani officers, there was a fair amount that was reported about Clinton's personal situation, and as Barbara raised a minute ago, almost none about Giuliani until very recently. And of course, Giuliani also had a reputation for locking up if you did start covering some of this issue. So, you've taken kind of the high road, but you also had a problem with losing access to your sources, in particular in the case of Giuliani.
I guess you didn't hear what I said before. What I said before was that we did not know about Giuliani's relationship. We knew that his marriage, unreported, we didn't. We reported that his marriage was in difficulty because that was public knowledge. We did not know, I can only speak for the reporters that I know, we certainly did not know that there was another woman in his life until it basically became public. And I'm trying to remember now how it became public. Yes, it was the Daily, yeah, I even wrote a column about this. Senior moment. That's right, the Post had been tipped off. Daily News and the Post had been tipped off because they had been seen at a restaurant near Elaine's, and there was Elaine's restaurant, and there were some reporters having dinner at Elaine's, and a friend of one of those reporters, who was a web reporter for Fox News, came in and said, "You'll never guess what's going on down the block." And he went over and he saw, and he, who was sort of a source for other reporters, he called one reporter at the Post and one reporter at the Daily News, and that's how it broke. We did not know. I think if reporters at the Post or the News or many other newspapers had known earlier, they would have done what they ultimately did. You keep forgetting, everybody keeps forgetting that it wasn't reporters who uncovered Clinton's relationship. It was the women who were having the relationships, and in one case went public at a news conference, and in another case sued him. And in a third case, a tape recording of a woman who was Lewinsky, who was having a relationship with him, became part of the lawsuit. It wasn't reporters who she doesn't want to believe it.
asked a different question. I
That-
asked you
but
a
you-
question, the
what was your
relationship
question?
between self-censorship and how you weigh access to sources. And
What's the
where-
question? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm asking you the question, how you sort out keeping access to your sources and when you report. That was my question.
How do
And
you
the
sort
reason
out
I'm saying-
keeping access to your sources and printing anonymous material? Is that your question? That, I'm going to give you an unsatisfying answer to that. The answer is that you have to weigh that if you are a responsible journalist on a case-by-case basis. It is impossible to have a blanket rule. Absolutely impossible. You have to judge the presumed credibility of your source. You have to judge whether maintaining a relationship with the source is important enough for the future. In many cases, it's not. And I could go into chapter and verse, but I'd have to recall some of the instances. Every single one of the, I'll give you one, can I give you an example just from this past week? It's not salacious, but it's interesting. I got a, sorry.
It's not salacious, we don't want
Sorry.
that.
No. I got a phone call from a police sergeant. He identified himself, he gave me his name, and he said he wanted to talk to me about the Central Park wilding incident, the riot, whatever you call it, the terrible violence incident, the brutality, let's call it that, in Central Park 2 Sundays ago. And he'd be happy to talk to me, but he wouldn't be quoted, and I by name. This kind of thing happens a lot. This is an anonymous source as far as the public is concerned. He and I talked for at least a half hour. I took down a lot of notes. And then I said to him, how do I know that you're you? How do I know that you are who you say you are? How do I know, not that he said anything, that was terribly offensive in any way. It was just interesting. I said, but even in that case, I was not going to put a word of what he said in the paper. He wasn't critical of anyone. It was not personal pejoratives. It was just an interesting interview. If you read it, it was in Monday's column, just about his perceptions of how police officers were conducting themselves, what drove them, why they did react or didn't react. The influence of Diallo, why they stood there like that, standing orders about not leaving your post. It was all kind of interesting cop stuff. Now, there was nobody who was being hurt by it. There was no negative pejorative and all of that stuff, but I didn't even want to print that unless I knew who he was. So I went through elaborate efforts that took about 2 hours because I couldn't blow his cover. I couldn't call the Public Information Department at the New York Police Department and say, is Sergeant Joe Schmo really who he says he is, and does he do what he says he does? So I had to go to a public phone because they have phones that give the phone numbers at the police department, and I had to call a number, and I had to check them out and use it. And anyway, I was able to check it out enough so that I felt confident. Now, to run it, if I had run his name, I would have certainly destroyed his career, and I certainly would never have heard from him again. The possibility of destroying his career was much more important to me than not hearing from him again, because he's not the kind of continuing source that you rely on. But it would be an unprincipled thing to do. So I checked him out. I was confident he was who he said he was. I was confident that he had the record he said he had, and I ran it. That kind of process is the process you go through, that a responsible journalist goes through with every person who requests anonymity.
Okay, we're nearing the end. What I would like to do is just turn it back to the two participants if they have any final comments. Geraldine, would you like to?
I think this has been an interesting hour and a half, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to come in and do it. To be quite frank, I'm at the stage where I do not like getting up and trying to fight traffic to come in here for 8:15 in the morning from Queens. But I think it's important that this kind of a discussion does take place. The unfortunate thing is that every campaign, as much as these discussions take place with academics and people who are interested in this issue, it really doesn't have impact on what's going to be done in a campaign. The campaign is going to get down to the very basics on who's going to be able to cover it, who's going to get the readers, who's going to get the viewers. I find it just keep an eye after this presidential campaign and look at the number of instances where the press will be writing about the press and how the press has covered the campaigns. I think that's a rather new phenomenon, where they're all writing about themselves. That, of course, is good for about a month after the campaign as well. I would hope that there would be more responsibility. I don't think, Barbara, that it's going to dissuade people from running. I really don't. I think if people really care about the issues, they're going to say, go ahead and do this. I will tell you one story, and that's in 1984, after the campaign. I was asked how I felt about running and would I have done it if I had known what to expect. And I said, what I probably would have done was if God had shown me a videotape of the 6 months of my life, starting in July of '84 until the end of December, I would have looked at it and said, you know, God, could you do me a favor and give it to Diane? And then I said, suppose God, and I don't want anybody to think I'm talking to God in my spare time. I do when I'm in church, but I pray like everybody else. But I said if I had said that to God and God had turned around to me and said, uh-oh, sorry about that, but if you're not willing to do it, we're not going to pick Diane this year. We're going to go with that gray-haired senator from Texas, Lord Benson. And I don't know when we're going to have a woman on the ticket. I would have gone home and said to my family, okay, what do you think? Is it important enough to open that door? And I have to tell you, I think my family would have said, no matter what happens, let's do it. Because I really do think that campaign made a difference. And I do think that a lot of the things that I got was because I was the first. I do hope, though, that the press would get a little bit more responsibility, because I think that's important to us. I think it's important to the political process. I think it's important to the future of this country. Thank you.
You have the truly last word.
I'll just say that a little bit of what I said before. I'm optimistic. I think that these discussions do make a difference, and I think that the public is becoming increasingly sophisticated about what it cares about and what it doesn't care about. I think it is a continuing responsibility of the media to inform the public, and it's also the responsibility of the public to decide what it cares about and what it does not. And what Geraldine said about the press writing about the press is also a positive thing, because we are doing a lot, not just on Ted Koppel on Friday nights. We're doing a lot of self-examination, and that can only be good. So I think it's all reflective of the political process in this country, which is a continuing self-corrective dialogue. And I think we're getting more and more adult about all of this.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming. If you're not on our mailing list, please leave either a card or your name and address so that we can invite you back in the fall. Have a great summer.